optimism, I think we all know, is the expectation that things will work out well. And we're all pretty good at that when it comes to our own lives, when it comes to our individual futures. We're quite good at being optimistic. What we're not so good at, particularly now, I think, in the 21st century, is being collectively optimistic in thinking about how our societies might be better tomorrow than they are today, or how the world might be a better place tomorrow than it is today. We are mostly optimistic about most things most of the time. And actually not even just people. In fact, animals behave in ways that we think of as optimistic as well. They tend to pick positive interpretations of the situations they find themselves in. The fact that optimism seems to be so hardwired into us and into the animal kingdom sort of suggests there must be some sort of reason that it persists, and some sort of evolutionary reason that it exists, not just something psychological and unique to humans. There are many kind of potential explanations, but the one that I found most compelling was that actually optimism is what makes you go and try and solve your problems when you don't have the evidence of those solutions, when you don't know what those solutions are. So one of the examples of this that I describe in the book is the story of Ernest Shackleton, the great Anglo-Irish polar explorer.
Ernest Shackleton was one of the foremost Antarctic explorers of the early 20th century. He was born in Ireland, but he moved to England at a young age, and he's perhaps most famous for his Imperial Transantarctic expedition of 1914 to 1917, where he aimed to become the first person to cross the entire Antarctic continent, but rather unfortunately he met with disaster on the way down. Before he even reached the land itself, his ship, the Endurance, got stuck in the ice, which wasn't unknown in Antarctic explorations. Quite often the ice grabs you and it will then let go. But for the Endurance, the ice stuck and held fast for 10 whole months. So for 10 whole months, they are drifting in the ice, not being able to control where the ship goes, until eventually the weight of the ice on either side crushes the ship.
In 1915, they had no way of reaching the outside world. They had no way of telling anyone they needed rescue, and they basically had no chance that anyone was going to come to save them.
People thought they were still crossing Antarctica fairly happily, so Shackleton realised if they're going to live, he was going to have to raise the alarm himself. He was going to have to do a voyage of probably 800 miles to find people, tell them what had gone wrong, and get a bigger ship to come down and pick up the entire complement of the 28 men. So Shackleton and 5 others jumped in this small lifeboat that was christened the James Caird. The James Caird voyage is often called one of the greatest open boat journeys in history because of the sheer scale of what Shackleton was able to do. He's using a small lifeboat that the carpenter has converted, and he's sailing 800 miles across the roughest seas in the world from Elephant Island to this tiny little island of South Georgia.
Once they were there, they had to kind of make repeated attempts to get back to rescue the people they'd left behind.
Long story short, he basically has to get 4 different ships before he's able to find one that will take him all the way to Elephant Island to pick the men up. To his relief, they are all still alive. They're all still there. One man's had to have his toes amputated, but beyond that, they're all in relatively good health.
In that situation, a lot of other polar expeditions, went completely wrong. They would fall into disarray and infighting. They'd use up their stocks, and basically everyone would die. In his memoirs, Shackleton points out that what kept them going throughout this was this shared optimism that they had, was this sense that collectively they were in it together, they would find a way out of their situation, and they didn't really have any evidence that they were going to be able to succeed, that if they set out in this little lifeboat that they would reach civilization. But they kind of had the belief that they could, and that I think is kind of the core of optimism. So there's also quite a deep connection between optimism and trust. When it comes to the problems that we as a society face, whether it's something like climate change or socioeconomic inequality or disruptive technologies like AI, these are collective action problems. They are not problems that any of us can individually solve, no matter how optimistic we individually are. For that, I need to be optimistic. I also need for you to be optimistic, and for everybody essentially to be optimistic, because that's how we will find the solutions that we need in this situation. And it goes back to Shackleton and his experience. It's that kind of trust that binds us together, that makes it easier to be optimists together. When there isn't that kind of trust that other people will do the right thing, it becomes very easy to become fractious and to fall apart. So how do you build optimism about the world rather than your own life? I think one of the reasons it's hard is because trying to solve all the problems of the world is obviously impossible for any of us, and it can be daunting, and the temptation is very strong to look at it and say, I cannot solve all of this. And I think what helps me there is to remember that where optimism came from as a philosophical idea. It started out as this kind of grand project to explain why the world is the way that it is. It was devised by Gottfried Leibniz, who's a great German polymath in the 18th century, as a way of explaining why the world is as good as it gets. And it kind of received a certain degree of acclaim until it met Voltaire, who is the great French satirist. And Voltaire thought this was a ridiculous idea, and in his book Candide, he basically trampled all over it. He writes Leibniz in as this ridiculous character, Dr. Pangloss, who spends his time insisting that all must be for the best, even though he and his companions are going through war and death and disease and mutilation and all manner of terrible things. But what Voltaire gave us, by way of a counterpoint, just in one line at the end of the book, the character Candide says, forget about all of that, we have to cultivate our garden. And what people have taken that to mean is think about what you can do locally. What happens in your communities, think about what happens with the people around you. There are a lot of times in life in the 21st century when it feels like there is nothing that you can do, that things have to be the way that they are, that this is either how the world was made, or this is how economics works, or what technology dictates, or how society is. Forget about the grand designs, forget about trying to solve the problems of the world. Think about what you can do locally. Think about what you can do in your own neighbourhood, in your own patch, to make things better.